Did you know that in the Middle Ages, you could legally settle a difficult divorce by fighting your spouse to the death in a specialized pit? We tend to think of medieval sports as just chivalrous knights in shining armor riding horses, but the reality was a financial black hole. The history books often leave out the money, but the reality is that these games were fueled by gambling, lawsuits, and insane insurance claims. In this video, we aren't just looking at the weirdest sports of history. We are breaking down the insane economics behind them. I'm going to show you how a single jousting match could bankrupt a nobleman, and why mob football terrified local merchants. We will also cover the bizarre sport that cost the equivalent of a modern Ferrari just to kill a few small foxes. By the end of this video, you won't just look at history differently. You will understand why modern sports betting is child's play. Stick around, because the number one sport on this list literally involved a divorce tax paid in blood and assets. Let's start with the people's sport, which was less like a game and more like a localized economic collapse for the town. If you think modern soccer riots are bad today, let me introduce you to Shrovetide football, the nightmare of the medieval merchant. The ball was usually a pig's bladder filled with air, but the goal was often a landmark like a church door or a specific tree. The field was the entire town itself, and the rules were non-existent, with no referees and no limits on team size. You could have 500 people against 500 people, brawling through the streets and destroying everything in their path. Murder was technically illegal, but accidental death during the game was often just considered a foul play by the authorities. This sport was a total nightmare for the local GDP because of the massive amount of collateral damage inflicted on shops. Imagine you are a merchant selling pottery, and suddenly 1,000 screaming peasants crash through your storefront. You aren't just losing your current inventory, you are losing your entire livelihood because the ball rolled under your table. Windows were smashed, fences destroyed, and livestock trampled, costing the town a fortune in repairs every single year. But the biggest economic impact wasn't even the property damage. It was the massive cost of lost labor productivity. These games could last for days, meaning fields went unplowed, blacksmiths stopped hammering, and goods stopped moving. This got so bad that in 1314, King Edward II of England issued a proclamation banning football in London to save the economy. He didn't ban it because he cared about people getting hurt. He banned it because he needed archers for his wars. Archery is a skill that takes years to master, and it drives the military economy, but men were playing football instead. The opportunity cost of football was a weaker national defense, so the king threatened imprisonment to stop the games. But the people loved the chaos too much, creating an economic tug-of-war between the state and the populace for centuries. Now, if you think that is a waste of money, that is pennies compared to what the rich were doing with their sport. We have all seen jousting in movies, but I want you to stop thinking of jousting as a sport and see it as venture capital. A fully equipped knight in the 15th century was the economic equivalent of a Formula One car today, costing a literal fortune. Custom-fitted plate armor cost the equivalent of a skilled laborer's wages for 10 to 20 years of continuous work. Then you have the horse, specifically destriers, which were incredibly expensive and bred specifically for high-impact collisions. A knight was essentially a walking corporation, employing squires, grooms, and armorers just to keep the operation running. Now, here is the secret economic engine of jousting that nobody talks about: the ransom system that drove the industry. In the early tournament circuits, if you knocked the other guy off his horse, you didn't just get a shiny trophy. You actually won his horse and his armor, effectively seizing his assets in a hostile takeover of his military equipment. You engage in a match that lasts 30 seconds, you win, and you have just acquired assets worth 20 years of salary. The loser now has to pay you back a ransom to get his gear back so he can compete again, creating a debt cycle. This created a class of professional tournament knights, who were more like hedge fund managers of violence than soldiers. The most famous was William Marshall, who rose from nothing to capture over 500 knights during his lucrative career. He accumulated massive wealth solely through the transfer of military assets in a sporting environment, becoming a legend. But the volatility was insane. One splinter of wood in the eye could liquidate your primary asset in a split second. Let's talk about the event hosting costs, like when King Henry VIII held a tournament called the Field of the Cloth of Gold. They built a temporary city with fountains running with red wine and wore clothes made of real gold thread for the event. The cost was so astronomical that it nearly bankrupted the treasuries of both England and France just to show off wealth. Imagine hosting the Olympics, but building the stadiums out of gold and then tearing them down after just 2 weeks. It was a geopolitical flex designed to signal economic strength, proving that their economy could burn money for fun. So we have the mob destroying shops and the knights trading Ferraris. But surely there was something even more absurd? This brings us to fox tossing, a sport invented by the German aristocracy in the 17th century out of pure boredom. A group of aristocrats would stand in a courtyard, holding long canvas slings on the ground, waiting for the animals. They would release foxes, badgers, or wildcats into the arena, and as the animal ran across, they pulled the sling tight. This launched the animal 20 or 30 feet into the air, often killing it on impact when it hit the hard ground. Putting aside the horrific animal cruelty, let's look at the massive supply chain required to host one of these events. For one specific event in Dresden, the Elector of Saxony brought in nearly 700 foxes and 500 hares. You have to pay trappers to catch these animals alive, transport them, and feed them until the event, costing a fortune. This sport highlights the massive wealth gap. Peasants starved while aristocrats spent tax dollars launching badgers. It is the ultimate example of disposable income, proving that when you have too much money, you invent stupid games. But sometimes the money wasn't just for fun. Sometimes the sport was the only way to save your assets in a court of law. We have arrived at the most high-stakes financial sport of all, the judicial duel, specifically marital dueling. In medieval German law, if a husband and wife had a dispute involving property or crime, they could fight it out legally. To make it fair, the man had to stand in a waist-deep hole and was armed with a wooden club to defend himself. The woman was free to move around the edge of the hole and was armed with a rock wrapped in a heavy cloth veil. The economics here are simple but brutal. Asset forfeiture, where the loser loses everything, including their life. If you lose, you don't just lose the argument. You are often executed and your property is seized by the winner. But let's zoom out to broader judicial duels, where wealthy merchants accused of crimes could hire professionals. This created a champion market, a gig economy of professional fighters who were the high-priced lawyers of their day. You paid them a retainer to be available and a massive win bonus if they managed to keep you out of prison or death. But there was a risk premium because in some places, if the champion lost, they were executed alongside the accused. Imagine if your lawyer went to the electric chair if he lost your case. That is a high-stakes labor market for talent. There is a famous case, the duel between Carriages and Legree in 1386, which dragged on for months of legal battles. The financial cost of the legal proceedings decimated their liquid assets before they even stepped onto the field. The fight itself was just the climax of a financial war that had already ruined both families through legal fees. These sports were mechanisms for wealth transfer. Mob football destroyed wealth, while jousting transferred it to the skilled. Fox tossing burned wealth to signal status, and duels transferred wealth based on legal disputes and combat skill. The Middle Ages were a time where play was serious business, and the economics of violence ruled the day. The expectation that these were simple times is false. They had complex economies where a pig's bladder could shut a city. These weird sports were a reflection of their economy, volatile, dangerous, and weighted towards the wealthy. The next time you complain about ticket prices, remember you aren't standing in a hole fighting for your life and assets. You also aren't paying a ransom to get your car back from the parking lot after losing a 30-second match. Reality beats expectations when you realize that history was just a series of high-stakes bets played by bored people. If you want to understand the present, you have to look at the financial madness of the past and learn from it. We have covered the destruction, the ransoms, the absurdity, and the legal battles that defined medieval entertainment. But there is one more layer to this economic onion that we haven't peeled back yet, and it involves the peasants. If you found this deep dive into the financial madness of history interesting, you need to see the other side of the coin. I have broken down exactly how the common people managed to survive in an economy rigged against them by the elites. It involves secret markets, hidden currencies, and the underground trade networks that actually built the world. To get the full picture, you need to click on the video that is on your screen right now to keep learning the truth. Click that video now to see how medieval peasants actually made money, and I will see you there in just a second.